In this video, we're going to go over Chapter 2, the function of a forensic scientist. In this video, we'll talk about the functions of a forensic scientist, what a forensic scientist does at the crime scene, in the lab, and then afterwards, the implications from the evidence that forensic scientists analyze, forensic scientists' role in the court, function of a forensic scientist. So, at the crime scene, forensic scientists, if they're there, then forensic scientists aren't always present at a crime scene, but if they are, they can recognize the physical evidence. They help recognize physical evidence, help to document the crime scene and the evidence, and then help collect, preserve, inventory, package, and transport the physical evidence. And at the crime lab, they analyze the physical evidence through tests, interpret the results of the analysis, and then report the results of analysis, which then the investigators look at to help them decide where to go in the case. And then afterwards, they present expert testimony. The overall goal of a forensic scientist is to make the facts of a case clear. They want it as clear as they can be so that there's no chance of refute. Another important aspect of forensic training is learning how to choose the appropriate analysis for the evidence that is gathered. There are a lot of different techniques and tests you can do, but each one takes time and money, so knowing which ones, the appropriate ones to do, will save you time and the money of the tests. There are different ways to analyze the same piece of evidence. There are a lot of issues to be considered when determining the test to perform. One of them is the quality and the quantity of evidence. If you only have a little bit of evidence, there might be some tests that you can't do because there's just not sufficient amount. For example, if you're analyzing a paint chip sample, the first step is to look at the paint chip under the microscope. Then, using the information you found looking through the microscope, you can determine what kind of chemical analysis test would be the best fit to get the most accurate results. So one thing is, so if you're analyzing chemical, we'll say cocaine, then the first thing you do would be to analyze it and see if there's more than one thing in it, because sometimes drugs can be cut with other drugs, so there's more than one drug present. So you would do a test to see if there is more than one present or if it was pure. If it was pure, then you could go analyze it with an instrument. If it's not, then you have to do a test or a procedure to separate the two drugs in the sample and then analyze each one separately. Forensic scientists rely on experience to know when they have performed enough tests on the questioned sample. You can perform test and test and test after for each piece of evidence if you have enough evidence, but sometimes you just can't get any more information out of the evidence than you have already gotten. Forensic scientists on experience will know when to stop. These tests can take weeks or even months to complete because of the technical requirement of different forensic tests, limited availability or integrity of some samples, so some of the samples are degraded or not enough, the complexity of testing for illicit and therapeutic drugs and other toxic chemical agents, and the extensive record keeping necessary for legal proceedings. Documentation, we talked about in a different video, documentation is so important for legal proceedings. It is huge. You need to document everything, but it's also time consuming. So sometimes that can hold things up. Sometimes tests are beyond a laboratory's scope of expertise. So it must send specimens to a more specialized laboratory. So let's say you have a bite mark and you can get some information out of it, but it is very important in the case. So you want to send it off for some more, so more expert or specialized people can look at it. And there's a private lab, forensic lab, that specializes in bite marks. And so you could send it to that lab and see if there's any more information that they can deduce out of that evidence. So this is a graphic to show the forensic lab evidence analysis workflow. So you have a crime reported, and does it need physical evidence? Then yes, you request physical evidence analysis. If it needs evidence analysis, if it's not physical but you still need evidence analysis, it goes to the forensic lab. If you need subjects identified, you don't take it to the lab. You take it to an investigation or a trial. And then, so you have all these requests for forensic evidence analysis. And then it's kind of like a bottleneck. You have all this information, but you can only do as much as the lab is capable of doing. So you do the analysis, then it undergoes reviews, quality and technical reviews, to make sure that the results are accurate and tests were performed correctly. And then the reports are approved, and then they go to the investigation or trial. They're sent to the reports and are sent to the investigator or prosecutor. So what is the goal of forensic scientists? The primary goal is to analyze the physical evidence to make the facts of a case clear. The main goal. Through analysis and interpretation, the experts can provide additional information that ties together facts of the case. One of them is the corpus delicti, modus operandi, don't speak Latin, linking a suspect and a victim, which is the Locard's exchange principle we went over in a previous video, linking a person to a crime scene, can disprove or support a suspect or a victim's testimony. We'll go over all these in detail as well. You can identify or eliminate a specific suspect through DNA profiling, provide investigative leads to the investigator for the case based on the results that you give them, and you can be called as an expert witness. So corpus delicti means body of the crime. This evidence proves that a crime has taken place and that what happened at the scene was not an accident. It was actually an intentional crime. For example, burglary, tool marks on a broken door would strongly indicate that there is forced entry. A ransacked room from which jewelry is missing would indicate that a crime had occurred as well. So this evidence, physical evidence that you see at the crime scene, would suggest that there's a crime happened, burglary, and not an accident of, I don't know, ransacking your room to find a ring. I don't know. And then another example is assault. So if the blood of a victim is on suspect's clothes or a blood-stained knife is nearby, which is always great to have, would strongly indicate that there is foul play at the crime scene. Modus operandi is the method of operation. It's also what you hear as a criminal's MO. So the characteristic way in which career criminals commit a particular type of crime. Their MO is modified for success. So each crime they commit, or over time during their crime spree or time they're committing crime, they modify their MO, how they commit the crime, to make sure that it's more successful. Usually you hear that the first time someone commits a crime, it's a little bit sloppy. Then the next time it's a little better, and then it continues to be modified until they have a good method to do the crime with leaving the least amount of evidence to get caught. For example, burglary, the types of tools used and tool marks they leave and the types of items taken are usually an MO. Arson, MO would be the type of accelerant used, the position in the building, and the technique that was used to ignite the fire they often turn out to be a particular arsonist's signature. So for arson, the type of accelerant used is usually dependent on what the arsonist likes the best, what they have found to work the best. Position in the building, again, over time they know where they want to put it. The difference between there's a difference between an MO and a signature. Sometimes they get a little confusing, but there's a difference. The MO is something you do when you commit a crime. A signature is something you would do unique to you after a crime. So let's say there's a person is sexually assaulting someone and they take a picture during the act and they use it so that the victim is embarrassed or feels terrible about it. Now there's proof that it happened, so they're less likely for them to come forward. That would be a signature. A signature would be they doing that, giving the photograph for a way for them to not come clean about the crime. So the crime has already been committed, and so the signature is for them to leave something behind to make them less likely to come forward. If a person is committing a sexual assault crime and they take a picture of the victim in order for them to feel empowered to commit the crime, then that would be part of their method of operation. They are using that picture in order to commit the crime. So an arsonist example for the method of operation, arsonist John Pillow Pyro Orr. He started about 2,000 fires. He was actually a firefighter or fire investigator. I don't remember which one. But so he knew a lot about fire. He liked fire ever since he was a kid. He used the same incendiary device for all his fires. A cigarette, so the bottom picture you can see a cigarette attached to a book of matches, wrapped in paper with cotton and bedding secured with a rubber band. So the top picture is actually a picture of the evidence that was collected of an actual case this person did, and the bottom is an example of what it would look like. So the cigarette would burn down and the matches would ignite the paper and the bedding around it, and that's how he got the name Pillow Pyro. This is his signature method of operation of what he would do. Second goal is, or third goal is linking a suspect and a victim. This is extremely important, particularly in cases of violent crime. So perpetrators and victims will usually leave evidence and trace evidence at the scene of the crime due to Lacard's exchange principle that we talked about before. Any contact will leave a trace, so there's usually always trace evidence. Trace evidence can be transferred between the victim and a perpetrator, and for this reason, every victim and every suspect must be thoroughly searched for trace evidence. Sometimes it might look a little cruel or not the nicest, or something that a sexually assaulted victim is inspected all over. All these different tests or samples are being taken from them. Every inch of their body is looked over. And this is because they want to solve the crime. They know that there's trace evidence on that person and they're trying to find it. So as an example, so you have a suspect, so you have evidence, you have a knife and bullet and gun at the crime scene. You have the knife and the gun, which are part of evidence, which can be linked to the suspect. Then that links the suspect to the crime. So the suspect is linked to the gun is at the crime scene, so the suspect is linked to the crime scene. Then the gun is at the victim, at the crime scene where the victim is. So there must be an exchange of material if that was used on them, or the knife. Well, usually the knife because it actually makes contact in the body, so there would be trace evidence from that. So the knife connects the victim to the suspect because it's the suspect's knife. So the suspect's knife is evidence that is at the crime scene. That knife is used on the victim, so that victim is now linked to the suspect through the knife. Linking the suspect and victim. Example, the Atlanta child murders. I don't know if you've heard of the show Mindhunters. It's on Netflix. It's really good. The second season is all about going over the Atlanta child murders. It's a show about serial killers and how they started. They actually coined the term serial killer. It's based off of the detectives that coined the term, and they were very instrumental in trying to find the Atlanta child murderer based off of FBI profiling of serial killers. I would check that out if I were you. The first episode or two isn't very good or exciting for Mindhunters, but then it gets pretty good. So in a 2-year period between 1979 and 1981, there were 29 people, almost all children, who were strangled. Police staked out a local river where other bodies had been dumped, and then they arrested Wayne Williams as he was driving away from the sound of a splash in an area where a body was recovered a couple days later. So they found out, the FBI helped find out kind of where the burial grounds would be. They found an area where there's a lot of dead bodies, and they, through the profiling and their experience, they said this is the area where they're most likely to dump a body. And so they had police stake out over there, and then they heard a splash in an area and one car driving away. So they stopped that car and talked to him, and it turns out to be the murderer. They found the body a couple days later because the body had washed away, but they were able to find someone. The police didn't witness him drop the body, so their case was based largely on forensic evidence gathered from fibers found on the victim. So the fibers from whatever the murderer used to strangle each of his victims. Again, trace evidence. The fibers will be transferred to the body. In all, there were nearly 30 types of fibers linked to items from Williams' house, his vehicles, and even his dogs. In 1982, he was convicted of killing 2 adult victims and sentenced to life in prison, although the Atlanta police announced that Williams was responsible for at least 22 of the child murders. There are some of the child murders, or they say that he's responsible for them, but he wasn't convicted, so I think they're still open as cold cases, along with the other 7. Or no, just all of them that aren't, except those 2 adult victims, are still listed as cold cases, I believe. So linking a person to the crime scene, perpetrators and victims will usually leave evidence and trace evidence at the scene of the crime. The cards exchange principle. We've already talked about it. Also, victims, perpetrators, and witnesses may carry evidence from the scene. So they may carry glass, soil, stolen property. At the crime scene, the perpetrator is stepping in the soil if it's outside, and he takes that soil home with him, and that soil stays on his boot. And now that the soil from the boot is compared to the soil at the crime scene, that perpetrator is now linked to the crime scene through that soil. And stolen property, obviously, if the perpetrator takes property and has it, then it links them to a crime scene. And then this evidence can be used to prove their presence at the scene of the crime. Example, fingerprints as well can link someone to the crime scene. Like for example, this is the Stratton brothers. So there's murders of Thomas and Anne Farrow, who were beaten to death, solved by using newly developed fingerprinting technique. The Farrows were small business owners, and they had a cash box. The officers found that it was empty, so they thought that robbery was most likely the motive. There's one print on the cash box that did not match the Farrows. They talked to people around, and they found a local milkman who reported seeing two young men near the Farrows' house on the day of the murders, and they were later identified as Alfred and Albert Stratton brothers. A week later, police found the Stratton brothers and fingerprinted them. Alfred's right thumb was a perfect match for the print on the Farrows' cash box. This linked Alfred Stratton to the crime scene. Fingerprint evidence became the prosecution's only solid evidence when the milkman could not identify the brothers. They found out it was the brothers based on activity around there, but the milkman didn't physically identify them. The Stratton brothers were convicted and hanged in 1905, and this was the first time cutting-edge technology was used in a high-profile murder case. Disproving or supporting testimony or suspect of witness can be more reliable than eyewitness testimony. If a person is accused of a hit and run, examination of the undercarriage of the car can reveal blood and tissue, but the vehicle owner claims he ran over a dog. So you would take samples of the blood and see if it came from a human or a dog, and therefore you can say this person didn't hit a dog, it's from a human, and this contradicts their testimony. And it could corroborate the victim's story if the blood matches the victim. So you can also contradict the information provided to investigators. You can discredit a witness and elicit a confession. Identification or elimination of a specific suspect through DNA profiling. Identification, fingerprints and DNA left at the crime scene are most conclusive ways of identifying a suspect because they're individual characteristics of that person and they are unique to that person. With the technological advances over the years, the amount of DNA needed for analysis has decreased a lot, and so the probability of finding DNA at the scene has increased. Now finding DNA at the crime scene is as likely as finding fingerprints, so that's good. And DNA can identify or eliminate a person from the crime scene. Elimination, physical evidence has exonerated more suspects than it has convicted. So for example, in the example of rape, the DNA was preserved. The preserved DNA was compared against a man convicted of the crime, and there is no match. So they do that a lot in the innocence program, trying to get try to get convictions erased for people based off of DNA evidence that they are not matched. Provide investigative leads. Physical evidence can be used to direct the course of the investigation. For example, a paint chip at the scene of a hit and run can be analyzed and used to narrow down the search for the type of car that might have been involved in the accident. There are properties of paint chips that are properties of paint that are only used on certain types of cars. And this can change the investigator's hypotheses as well. So it can support or refute a theory. If it refutes it, then the investigators know to look in a different direction. Expert testimony. Experts express an expert witness, not an express expert opinion, has solid foundation based on test results. There's a federal rule for evidence, which regulates the admissibility of testimony by experts. What it basically says is that if there's sufficient scientific evidence and knowledge from the expert witness, they may form an opinion if it's based on sufficient facts, if it's product of reliable principles and methods, and if the expert witness has applied these principles and methods reliably to the facts of the case. So experts must evaluate the evidence and provide an analysis that goes beyond the expertise of the layperson. So factual evidence is often given by a layperson. They present facts and observations, which never contain personal opinions. The experts look at these facts and observations, analyze them, and come to a conclusion of the most probable reason that they got that analysis. They can state opinion, but opinion must rest on a reasonable scientific certainty based on their training and experience, and must be related to the case or evidence in question. So a forensic scientist's interpretation of scientific test result is the most significant area of disagreement during cross-examination. The scientist forms an opinion based on what they consider to be the most probable explanation of results. Another forensic scientist might have a different opinion based on that. Before testifying, the court has to qualify the expert through a procedure known as voir dire, or speaking the truth. The courts rely on the training and expertise of the witness. Again, the judge decides if the expert witness is qualified or not. So they look at the counsel often cites information that emphasizes the expert ability and proficiency related to the competency, which, for example, their degrees and awards. They're more likely to qualify as an expert if the expert has previously qualified by other courts. Opposing attorneys can cross-examine the expert witness. The question of precisely which credentials are suitable for expert qualification is subjective, which makes it, subjectivity is not always the best in science. So it's kind of hard to maintain a good continuity for experts. So in summary, I hope you learned that forensic scientists recognize and help collect evidence at crime scenes, analyze the evidence, interpret them, and report the results. The goal of forensic scientists is to make the facts of a case as crystal clear as possible. With the information found through their analyses, forensic scientists can provide information about the body of the crime, the motive or the method of operation of the crime, linking a suspect and a victim, linking a person to the crime scene or a place, disproving or supporting testimony of someone, identifying or eliminating suspects through DNA profiling. Forensic scientists don't eliminate or eliminate suspects based on their alibis, or let's say they were at the drugstore at the time of the murder. That's not on the forensic scientist. The only way forensic scientists can identify or eliminate suspects is through the DNA profiling. They also provide investigative leads and provide expert testimony as an expert witness.